now we've got Neil Peterson, who's Senior Content Developer at Microsoft. He's going to be taking us through the new Azure CLI. So, over to you, Neil.
Great. Thanks for coming out. So my name is Neil Peterson. I'm a content developer for Microsoft. Basically, what that means is I write docs. So I write documentation for Azure IaaS, Azure Container Service, Azure Container Instances, Azure Container Registry. A lot goes into that. I mean, we write the samples, a lot of the code, and then I do sessions like this to kind of evangelize the Azure product. So this session, I'm going to kind of do a deep dive on the Azure CLI. Now, it's not a very complex product, so when I say deep dive, you know, we're not going to go in and look at much of the actual code of the CLI, but really everything you need to know to use the CLI, basically from front to back. So before getting into that, I'm assuming because you're here, you're working with Azure in some capacity. Is that correct? Working with Azure? Great. Is anybody working with the CLI at this point? How about the PowerShell module? A little bit more? Okay, cool. And I'll talk about that a little bit, like, oh, why so many options? Quick agenda, just going to introduce it, the basics of the CLI, resource creation, querying data. So creating resources is pretty easy, but like using the CLI to get data back, there's some little tricks around that we'll look at. Scope configurations, which we'll see, interactive CLI, so kind of how to use the CLI's help functions to discover, you know, what parameters do I need to provide to this command. And one of the things that I really like about the CLI is it's a great way to learn about Azure. It's got a great help system. So like if I'm working with a new resource type, like a container instance, you know, just using the CLI's help capabilities or the interactive capabilities, I can very easily learn like what capabilities do container instances have. So it's a great tool for also learning, not only managing Azure, but learning Azure. A little bit on troubleshooting, a little bit on the CloudShell. Has anybody used the CloudShell or seen the CloudShell? So it's pretty cool. We'll take a look at that. And then a little bit about the community, the GitHub project. And I've got a couple slides here. Actually, I've got a pretty big deck. I'm really going to go through about 3 or 4 slides and then just do all demos. Now, I had to do a very last-minute hardware change, so hopefully everything works out. But before we dig right into the CLI, just kind of a real quick primer on what are the management tools that are available for Azure. And I'm not going to like pit them against each other and like, you know, do deep dive on pros and cons, but there are quite a few different ways that we can work with Azure. We've got the Azure portal, pretty self-explanatory. We've also got a REST API. I don't work with it a whole lot, but that is available for, you know, doing things like writing .NET applications that create VMs or whatever it may be. PowerShell module, CLI. And I've got a fourth one down here, Azure Resource Manager templates. I wouldn't really call that a management interface. I mean, that's more of a declarative document on what I want to create in Azure, and then I can use at least 3 of these other 4 to deploy templates. I don't know if there's a endpoint on the REST interface for consuming the JSON template, but without doubt, I can use the CLI, PowerShell, or the portal to deploy a template. So it's not really a management interface, but I thought it was worth including. And then, so let me just, because it always comes up, just talk about the PowerShell module in the CLI, like, oh, why would I choose one over the other? And again, I'm not going to like, you know, make it a religious war or anything, or like code too deep on comparing them, but you know, there are some great use cases for either one. Let me start with the CLI. I mean, why would I choose the CLI? Why do I, like me personally, choose the CLI? And a little bit of my background, I am a Windows user. I have been most of my life. I've only recently, since I've been doing the container stuff at Microsoft, have I started using Linux or Macintosh or whatnot. But one of the great use cases for the CLI is that it's totally cross-platform. So I can use the CLI on a Windows machine, a Macintosh, or a Linux machine, and it's the exact same CLI. So, first, like, great use case. I'm on a Macintosh. I want to manage Azure. Boom, here's a CLI. Now, I know the worlds are converging, and we've got PowerShell available for Mac. I'm not totally up to date on the state of the Azure PowerShell module. I know there's some .NET Core dependencies and whatnot to run PowerShell on Mac. So I don't know where we're quite at with that. So we may be at a place where I can manage Azure with PowerShell on a Mac. I just don't know. I know we're getting there. But yeah, so first great use case, cross-plat. But then personally for me, what I found as I've been using the CLI is it's great for just like really quick, like I just need to spin up something really quick. I don't want to write a script. I just want to run a single command, or I just want to see what resource groups I have and delete one really quickly. CLI is great for just like kind of interactive management of Azure resources. Whereas if I've got to do anything that's going to be complex and have a bunch of lines and require looping and text parsing and whatnot, I'm going to use PowerShell most of the time just because of the native object orientation that comes with it and some of the the robust scripting capabilities there. So yeah, CLI cross-plat, really good for interactive stuff. And don't get me wrong, we'll actually see it. You can write huge scripts using CLI. In fact, I'm going to show one that I've written. It's just, I personally like PowerShell and the object orientation. So CLI, quick interactive, PowerShell, robust scripting environment. What is the CLI? It's a cross-platform command line interface for managing Azure. I've already talked about the different environments you can run it on. And one I haven't talked about is CloudShell, which is an in-browser bash shell that has CLI natively installed on it. It also does some cool things around authentication, and we'll look at that. You can create and manage Azure resources from the command line, pull back information, write scripts with it, etc. One of the kind of neat things is that it's not, it's not like a environment of its own. It's a executable. So I can actually run CLI commands in bash. I can run them in command.exe. I can actually run CLI commands in a PowerShell shell if I wanted to. So I mean, it's just a tool that can be used across all these different environments. And I think with that, I'm just going to jump in. I'll talk a little bit about installation, and then I'm just going to jump into demos. I'm not going to demo installing it. We've got good documentation around that. But in addition to installing the CLI on Windows, Linux, or Mac OS, we also have a Docker image available, which is really neat. I mean, to just be able to fire this thing up and have access to the CLI. And then the one that I wanted to point out there is nightly builds. I should have brought this up when I talked about what is the CLI. Microsoft has open sourced a lot of software. And some of that, and I'm just going to be very, very open about this, some of it like open source PowerShell. I mean, you've got a really big established code base that's basically been put on GitHub, and you look at the project, it's pretty daunting. There's quite a bit to it. The CLI is truly it started as an open source project. It's always been run as an open source project. I mean, you can go into GitHub and look at the history of this project pretty much since its inception. And what's really interesting about this, we were talking about this at the speaker's dinner last night, as a Microsoft employee, if I need support on the CLI, I don't reach out to somebody in Microsoft. I go to the GitHub project. So not only is it an open source project, it's managed in the open, it's supported in the open, and even as a Microsoft employee, we engage in the project in the open in GitHub. So I'm opening issues or going to GitHub for support on it all the time. It's a very interactive community. The maintainers are very responsive, and it's a great project. Included in that is this nightly build thing. So CLI is iterated on very fast. I think they cut a new build every month or something, but we're merging in PRs daily that add capabilities, fix bugs, etc. And you can actually grab the latest. I don't know if it's like a day-to-day. Well, I mean, I think the build runs every night. So you can like grab an experimental or kind of released version of the CLI every night to kind of get access to these new features that have been merged in. So it's really cool. I mean, we've kind of beat it to death, like, oh, Microsoft is going through all these changes and loves Linux and loves open source. But I think the CLI, the project itself, is a really good functioning example of the changes that are going on in Microsoft. So, and I would encourage you, like, I'm new to open source. It's a good project to kind of latch onto and like, hey, I want to check out what this open source stuff is and get involved in something. I mean, the CLI, in my opinion, is a great kind of starting point there. So with that, I'm just going to jump into some demos. So I'm going to kind of do something a little backwards here. I'm going to show off kind of a complex CLI script. And what I did is I went and, what's the most complex thing I've written? And basically what I have here is this builds out a Docker Swarm cluster in Azure, an Azure SQL database. It loads an app into the Docker Swarm cluster with the backend in SQL. And we won't go into all the details, but there's a lot of CLI stuff going on in this script here. And a lot of this is the stuff that I'm going to talk about. I wanted to show this off, and I was going to actually launch it up here on stage and then come back to it. But because I switched machines at the last moment, I went ahead and ran it just to make sure it ran. But I like to do things live. So while I'm not launching it, I just ran it just over there. Here's all the output. So we're going to work our way up to this. We're going to start off with very simple commands, look at output, look at taking variables or values and dropping them into variables, and kind of hit on all the things that I'm running in this script. And then we'll come back and look at some of those things, because all my demos are going to be very simple. We'll then take a lot of those learnings, come back, and I'll point out some of the pieces in this complex script. And if you go check out my GitHub account, I've got tons of stuff, including this stuff out there. All right, so that said, and I've got my notes over here. So, Azure CLI. The first thing you're going to want to do is, once you get it installed, is log in. So AZ, and can you all see that? Maybe, is that better? All right, so AZ log in. And there's a couple different ways to log in, but this is the easiest one. You kind of have to be present. You can provide it credentials. You can use a service principal if you want to bake it into a script. But basically what it does is it gives you a URL here. You go to that URL, drop this code in the browser, then it will ask you to authenticate with Azure. Once you do that, boom, your CLI will come back and be hooked up. I'm not going to go through that process. It's very, very simple. And then the first thing we probably want to do is start exploring. So what do I have here? Like any good CLI, it's pretty easy to grab help. So I'll do AZ Help, which is really neat because it shows me a couple things. Like, what are the resources that I can manage with this thing in Azure? We can see I've got VMs, VM scale sets, got containers up here. So this is ACI, Azure Container Instances. And this is not a container talk, but if you were in the last session, as you saw, container instances start really quickly. So most of my demos are CLI demos, but I'm going to be using containers just as the resource, just because we don't have time to sit here and watch VMs deploy and stuff. But yeah, so I can see kind of all the things that I have access to in here. Let's start with resource group. Is everybody familiar with a resource group? It's just kind of like a logical container that I put resources in. So let's see, I've got it in here somewhere. So group right there. So, okay, I'm using this thing. I see that I've got resource groups, but now what can I do with those? So I'm going to do AZ group help. Cool. So I can see I can create, delete, exists, export, list, etc. Most resources have a very common set of commands. So when I'm about to run AZ group list to return a list of groups, I can do the same. I can do AZ VM list or AZ container list. So there's this common set of commands across resources. We'll take a look at VMs later. I'm not going to deploy a VM. I mean, we've got like, a couple commands here. I mean, VMs gets pretty hairy. But there is this, create, delete, list, show, update, wait are pretty common across a lot of the resources. So let's do AZ resource or AZ group list. And what you're going to see here is that it just spit out a bunch of JSON. So JSON is kind of the default output. And the details don't matter here. I'm about to show you how to make this a little bit more readable. But JSON is the default output for basically any command that you run in the CLI, including list or show, which returns resources. So that's great, but I don't want to parse that with my brain. So we can change that output type. -- output. And I'm going to dig into output a little bit more here in a second. But for now, we'll just do output table. And what you can see is now I've got kind of a readable table. But notice that I don't have all the information here that I had in the JSON output. So when we format to table, the CLI is kind of configured to provide a specific set of details. When we get into querying, I'll show you how to change that. And I want a table that has these 3 columns, not the 3 defaults that you gave me. I did a -- output. We've also got short names as well, so I can just do -o. And the help commands will kind of show you which commands have long names and short names. So we can see that that's going to return something very similar. Okay, so we've returned a little bit of data. So let's go ahead and delete something. But before we do, let's learn how to delete something. So AZ group delete. We saw that I had the delete command earlier, so let's go, now I want to run that. So how do I do that? AZ group delete help. Okay, cool. So I've got some information here. Arguments, name. So I've got to give it the name of the resource group that I want to delete. I don't know if there's a way without scripting to do like a delete all. I think with PowerShell, you could do git Azure RM group and pipe it to delete Azure RM group, and it would delete everything in your subscription. I don't know about here, but we can see that a name is required. So this is important here. I know the minimum I can give this command to delete it, but what else is here? No wait. Okay, do not wait for the long-running operation to finish. I probably want to do that here because we don't want to wait for this thing to delete. So if I don't use this, it'll sit there and spin while the resource group is deleting, and then return shell access once that resource group has deleted. So I want to use this so that we just fire off the command to Azure and return to the shell. And then yes, basically no prompts. So let's do it. So let me select a resource group. Yes, no wait. And name. And I'll just do demo 3. These arguments, there's no positioning in here, so I can put the arguments in any different order that I want.
When you use the no wait option, what happens if the operation that you kicked off actually fails?
Yeah, so it doesn't come back and tell you that.
Right, so it's just like a fire and forget.
Yes, exactly. Now, I mean, there are ways that you could go back with the CLI and return information about the operation, or you can always go to the portal and and see something. But absolutely, when you're deploying something, that's where it becomes critical that you do have some sort of follow-up, because we also have this. Think about it, if I'm deploying a bunch of VMs, I mean that's going to take a while. I want to return back to my shell. You're a good call. I have no assurance at that point that my operation was successful. All right, so actually we'll do an AZ group list. In fact, we can see right there that the operation is running, so my group is deleting, but so I could monitor it or whatnot. And yeah, so that's really, I touched on a bunch of things there. We're going to dig on some of those deeper, but that's 101 CLI. So let's go ahead and create some stuff here. Just in the sake of time, I'm not going to do help, so AZ group, create, and I'll do, actually, for the sake of time, just to make sure I don't mess anything up, I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste some stuff. So I'm going to create a resource group. So I've got a resource group named WinOps demo. And actually, just to kind of see this thing in action, let's take a look at the portal. Boom. There's my resource group, WinOps demo. And we can also see that demo 3 is gone. So that delete operation has been completed. Oop. And now let me go ahead and create something. And I'm going to create a container or a container instance. So if we were to run help, what we would see is that I need to give it a name is required, an image, so a container image. In this case, I'm pulling it from Docker Hub in a resource group. Public IP address is not required, but I want to be able to hit the container from the internet, so I'm giving it that public IP address. So I'll go ahead and put that in there. Boom, it's been created. So let's do AZ container list. All right, so there's a whole bunch of stuff in there. Oop. Oh. I format to a table. You can actually see that I've got quite a few in there. So, all right, I want to filter that down a little bit. I want to see just the containers in a specific resource group. So AZ container list, I can do tab, I'm sorry, dash. And what I did there was --R and a tab. So we do have some auto completion capabilities. And let's see, what did I name that group? WinOps demo. All right, cool. And actually, let's make that easier to read. Cool. All right, so we can see that the provisioning state has succeeded. And here's my IP address. Just to make sure that everything is working, let's go ahead and take a look at that. This is just a little personal website that I put together. It's my son on Halloween a couple years ago. So that was just a simple creation operation. Now I want to talk about VMs a little bit here, and this is going to get into some of kind of the cool features of the CLI, but things to watch out for as well. Let's do AZ VM create. Who's using Azure VMs? Quite a few. Okay, so this is worthy. So if we look at AZ VM create help, there's quite a bit here, quite a bit of arguments. You think about it, you're creating a VM, you've got network security groups, network security group rules, subnets. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that goes into creating a VM. However, if we look here, there's only 2 required arguments here, name and a resource group. It's like, how's that possible? Like, how can I create a VM and not specify all this stuff? And then as well, if I come down here and look at the example, that's pretty simple. Well, this is really cool. One of the things that Azure CLI does is it's kind of baked in with a bunch of defaults. So if we look at here's a good one right here, NSG rule. So it will automatically, so defaults to open ports for allowing RDP on Windows or SSH on Linux. So the CLI is like a bunch of defaults baked into it. Who's created a VM with an Azure VM with a PowerShell module? It's like painful. I mean, seriously, it is. I mean, you've got 30 lines minimum of code to create a VM, whereas here I can do it in like a half a line. That said, though, there are some disadvantages. There's some things to be aware of here. Like sometimes you just do not want those defaults. I'm not going to actually dig into it just for the sake of time. But like, for instance, I've got it, I ran into a situation where I was exposing a front-end VM, but I had a back-end VM that I didn't want SSH opened up on it. So I had to do things like pre-create the network security group, pre-create the rules that I wanted to, and then work with the CLI, I think like right here. Actually, what it was is I wanted the network security group attached to the subnet, not the VM. And if you look here on NSG, you can specify empty quotes for none. But so I had to work with this. So the point is, you just need to be aware the CLI has a certain set of defaults, and sometimes you don't want to accept those defaults. And there are ways around them, but sometimes you just have to monkey around with it a little bit. Cool. So now let's get into querying in output format. We've already done a little bit of it. So let me just do AZ container list. All right, so list every container that I have. There we go. In a table format. That's pretty easy. We've got other formats too. So I actually have a slide on this. So we've got JSON, table. I think there's like a color-coded JSON output format. And then there's TSV, which I don't remember exactly what that stands for. Tab-separated format. And this is important. So like, we can already see I've got like dashes in there, and I've got formatting going on. But if I wanted to like store this data into a variable so that I could use that later, I don't want the data formatted. I need like raw data. So I can do the same thing here, but instead of table, do TSV. You can see there, now I've got raw data. Now I've got a lot of it. That's probably not how I want to see it, and we'll get into kind of trimming that down and doing some like intelligent stuff. So I'm going to do some copy and pasting. Oh. Oh, come on. All right, so what I'm doing here is AZ container list -- query. What I'm saying here is I'm not expecting an array. So if I did have an array and I wanted like the second element of the array, I'd put a 2 in there. And I want to return just the name and the location. All right, boom, you can see it's JSON formatted. Let's say I wanted that in a table. All right, boom, there it is. But notice I've got column 1 and column 2. Maybe I wanted to name these columns, like pretty this up a little bit. Not a problem. So what I've got here is pretty much the same thing. Notice my square brackets changed to squiggly brackets. And we've got all this documented. And now I'm giving it column, the first column, I want it to be named name, and I want to put the container name in there. Second column, location. Boom. So now I've, modified my column names. And we've just have 2 here. You could build something big. There's a bunch of different properties attached to that container. If I wanted the IP address in here, it would just be building out that query string. In fact, let's do that. Let's say instead of that stuff, I want to pull the IP address. Actually, let's do this. Now let's say I want to find, bear with me, Surface Pro touch keyboard. Now let's say I want to find some resource based on an attribute of that resource. So I want to query on a value. Like earlier, we filtered my list of containers based on the resource group name, but maybe I just want to find a container that has a specific name. I don't know the resource group name, so I don't have all I have is the name to go off of. So we can actually do -- query, question mark contains, name, comma, and then the value that I want to query on. So if I run that, boom. Let's actually format that. Boom, so I just have the one. So earlier we filtered on the resource group. Here we actually looked for the name. Now let's say I want to get the IP address. All right, so again, we're filtering on the name, and I'm selecting the IP address. Boom, so there's the IP address. Now notice here that I've got this IP address .ip. Like, how did I get that? So let me do this. Basically, what I consider like walking the JSON. So, I noticed in here, and basically I would just go list my containers and then walk down the JSON, finding the string of properties that gets me to the value that I need. So we can see here I've got IP address and then squiggly brackets and IP. So I was able to pull it together from the raw JSON. Okay, so we just saw I got the IP address. However, I had it in a table format. I want to get this thing. I ultimately want to like store this IP address in a variable so that I can use it in a script. This comes to that TSV output value, so tab separated values. So notice I have something very real looking there that I can now use. And so if I wanted to, and I'm using bash here, but I could simply declare a variable IP equals $, wrap these things in brackets. I should see nothing come back. However, if I do echo IP, boom, there's my IP address. So real quick primer on querying data. It can get complicated sometimes, like when you've got a JSON that's really nested and you're trying to do a complex query. I mean, this is, again, I don't want to, compare PowerShell and CLI too much, but it's in these complex queries where you're like, oh man, give me some PowerShell, like just help me get this data easier. So, so that's using the CLI. So let's look at interactive real quick. So AZ interactive. And this is pretty simple. I won't spend a whole lot of time on it. So what this does is it brings up like an interactive shell. Actually, before I do that, if I do like AZ VM create, I do tab. Is it -- tab. It should bring up a list of like all the arguments needed. So there's a bunch of help available. We already saw auto completion. Here I've got a list, but maybe I want something a little more interactive and cute. So AZ interactive brings up this console type thing, and I can do, and you no longer, once you're in interactive, you don't have to run the AZ command. So I can do like VM. All right, now I see all the argument or all the commands that I can run. So let's do create space. Cool, and I can actually like use my arrow keys through here and see like, okay, admin username, what is it? All right, boom. All right, resource group, boom. So just a neat way to kind of explore the CLI. Now there are some kind of gotchas here. So for instance, if I wanted to run just a command. So let's say I'm using this to create VMs, but now I want to, like, whatever, list what's in this directory. You'll see that that fails. So there are ways to do this. It's kind of weird. You put in a hash symbol, ls, and now all of a sudden I can run non-Azure commands in interactive mode. Cool. Really quickly, I talked about scoped configurations. I am running out of time, so I will keep this brief. So if I do AZ container list, again, it's going to return everything. Maybe I only manage, maybe like, I'm using a shared subscription and I only manage a single resource group and I only ever work in that resource group. And, I'm tired of having to specify the resource group every time I do something. There is a way that I can scope the CLI down so that it just understands that this is the default resource group or the default command or the default whatever every time I run a command. So in this case right here, what was I going to do? So I'm going to scope CLI to VM. I'm going to skip this demo. Just understand that there is a way I can scope it so that it's the CLI has a default resource group. Yep, go ahead.
Is that just you could do that interactively with CLI, or could I administer it to make sure that you can only access it?
I'm not sure about that. Like apply some sort of policy, like hey, if you're in this AD security group, your CLI is scoped to this specific command. So I know that it's a value stored in a file on the file system. So there's got to be some way you can figure it out.
I could do that with it.
Yep. Cool. So I'm not going to, just in the interest of time, I'm not sure what's going on there. So that's cool. Now, troubleshooting. AZ group create. And like we already saw that if the required values on AZ group create is a name and a location. So I'll give it a name, but I'll leave off the location. So that's going to fail. All right, what's going on? Debug. Boom. There's a bunch of stuff in there. I won't dig into it, but you can actually see the calls that it's making to the Azure REST API. And this is good to know, like if you run into issues with the CLI and you go open up an issue on GitHub, just throw this in there because somebody's going to come back around and ask you for it. Cool. Now, CloudShell. And this is pretty cool. So what CloudShell is so I'm working in the Azure portal here. Notice up here I've got this little shell-looking button. Oh, session expired. All right, I'll tell you what. Interesting. Doesn't seem to want to cooperate all of a sudden. So CloudShell is basically the Azure CLI in a browser. So if we had hit that button up at the top, it would bring open a shell-looking experience at the bottom of my browser. The Azure CLI is installed in that shell along with a bunch of other tools. And I really wish I could show it off. Docker is installed on it. A bunch of text editors are installed in it. And it really is a bash experience, soon to be PowerShell as well. Some of the cool things there is it authenticates you using the cached credentials in your browser. So you're already logged into the Azure portal. You open that thing up, you don't have to run AZ login. It's already there. And you can run CLI commands straight from your browser. In fact, not only straight from your browser, but we have also recently on my team integrated these with our documentation. So I'm on the Azure Linux VM documentation here. We've got these try it buttons. Yeah, see, I'm not logged into the portal. I don't know what's going on, so it wants me to log in. We'll see if it'll work. All right, cool. Now it does takes a moment to fire up what's going on, and this isn't advertised and stuff, but this is running in a container on a cluster in Azure, and it's firing that thing up. And there's some pretty cool things about CloudShell. When you start CloudShell for the very first time, it'll create a storage account. And so if I do ls, you can see I've got this thing called Cloud Drive. If I go into Cloud Drive and do ls, you can see I've got demo.sh already there. So I can actually create files and scripts in CloudShell, close my session, whatever I want. If I could get into Azure, we could actually dig into the storage account and see that that file's in there. So it's saving my files from that session in a storage account. But this is kind of weird. I didn't intend to do this demo from docs, but roll with it, yeah. So if we do AZ, whatever, help, it's the exact same experience that we've seen, all the way down to AZ Interactive. Boom, exact same experience we saw before. And then watch this. Not CLI related, but I can do like nano test.sh. Boom, I've got a text editor right in my browser, and I've just created a text file. So if I do cat test, we can see there's the text from my text file. So we got about 3 minutes left. I think that was about what I wanted to cover. I skipped over a couple little things, but again, just to summarize, I mean, it's not a very complex product, but it's really great for just day-to-day management, especially if you're working on a non-Windows system. Oh, and actually, there's more. We just looked at a lot of little basic commands, but without doubt, you can do very complex things here. So I've just got a bash script setting some variables, and you can see here, like I'm doing things like creating a service principal. Yeah, ignore whatever's going on over there. Creating a service principal, storing that value in a variable, which I then use later on. I'm not doing like any looping or anything in here, but you can see like you can do some pretty heavy-duty stuff with this if you're so inclined. So some real work there. So with that said, we got about 2 minutes. Any questions?
So let's say if a resource gets a new API, do you need to install any modules on your machine to sort of interact with the?
Nope. You update the CLI.
Yeah.
And like I said very early on, it's quick. I mean, and it is kind of a pain because, I mean, this has happened to me at least 3 times in the last year where I'm like, oh, this thing is broken again. Like, what's going on? Not broken again, but like, hey, this thing is not doing what I need it to do. I'll raise an issue, and it's like, oh, hey, have you updated? Like, oh, I go update the CLI, and oh, never mind, I just needed to update. So it updates quite frequently. Like I said, I think about once a month. Question over here.
So you're connected to a storage account there with the storage you were pointing at and those files you're reading from. Is there any opportunity to mount like a shared storage drive that your team can share scripts on?
I believe so.
Okay, cool.
And somebody's written a pretty cool blog around just that. I don't remember the details at this moment. So I appreciate you coming out, and I hope this was helpful. And I mean, I'm a believer. I've been using it for a while now, and it is my day-to-day kind of small command driver. I like it quite a bit. So thanks a lot.